Okay, we continue our study of the minor prophet Joel tonight, and we're going to be looking at chapter 3 of Joel and wrapping up our study. Lord willing, next time we'll begin Amos, but we're wrapping up Joel tonight. The title of today's message is Reversal of Fortunes. Reversal of fortunes. Before I dive into that, though, let me just go back to chapter 2 for a minute that we covered last time. In the last few verses in that chapter where Joel writes, I will display wonders in the sky and on the earth. This, of course, is God talking. Blood, fire, and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And it will come about that whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be delivered. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be those who escape, as the Lord has said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls. I commented when we were together last time that I connected what is described here to the second coming of Christ, and I don't think that's totally out of bounds. But after thinking about it some more, and Oliver reminded me that Jesus actually either alludes to or quotes some of those verses there in his Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. And so it's very likely, seems to me, that the most immediate fulfillment of those verses, that prophecy, is in the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70, because that's what Jesus is talking about in the early part, at least in the early part of his Olivet Discourse. But there certainly could be application to the second coming, which is what I was trying to get at. We'll see a similar thing in our discussion tonight. But let's look now at chapter 3. I'm going to read the whole chapter, and then we'll come back and walk through it a few verses at a time. For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes, reversal of fortunes, right, of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there, on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land. They have also cast lots for my people, traded a boy for a harlot, and sold a girl for wine that they may drink. Moreover, what are you to me, O Tyre, Sidon, and all the regions of Philistia? Are you rendering me a recompense? But if you do recompense me, swiftly and speedily I will return your recompense on your head. Since you have taken my silver and my gold, brought my precious treasures to your temples, and sold the sons of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks in order to remove them far from their territory, behold, I am going to arouse them from the place where you have sold them, and return your recompense on your head. Also I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the sons of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabeans, to a distant nation, for the Lord has spoken. Proclaim this among the nations. Prepare a war. Rouse the mighty men. Let all the soldiers draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am a mighty man. Hasten and come, all you surrounding nations, and gather yourselves there. Bring down, O Lord, your mighty ones. Let the nations be aroused, and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness. The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth tremble. But the Lord is a refuge for his people, and a stronghold to the sons of Israel. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. So Jerusalem will be holy, and strangers will pass through it no more. And in that day, the mountains will drip with sweet wine, and the hills will flow with milk, and all the brooks of Judah will flow with water. and a spring will go out from the house of the Lord to water the valley of Shittim. Egypt will become a waste, and Edom will become a desolate wilderness, because of the violence done to the sons of Judah, in whose land they have shed innocent blood. But Judah will be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem for all generations. And I will avenge their blood, which I have not avenged, for the Lord dwells in Zion. So we saw in the last passage of Joel, God's promise to those who repented from their sins. After the Babylonians had invaded and chastised them, God promised the penitent, the repentant, that they would have material prosperity and security. We talked about that last time. And that they would receive a closer, intimate relationship with God when the Spirit was poured out on all flesh, which of course we know began or happened, that fulfillment was on Pentecost in the New Testament, right? In this text right here, Joel continues to speak of God's blessing to his people. In a sense, this passage presents us with a full reversal of all the curses inflicted on the nation in chapters 1 and 2. The invasion of Judah is replaced by judgment on the invaders, verses 1 through 3. Drought and crop failure replaced with abundant supply of food and water, in verse 18. Desolation of the nation replaced with the desolation of the enemies of Judah, and the promise of a restored Judah that's going to be inhabited forever, in verses 19 and 20. Right? But let's look closer at this passage for its permanent significance for you and me. In verses 1 through 3, look back there. In verses 1 through 3, God promises to judge the nations that invaded Judah. That's mostly the Babylonians, but they had help, right? Promises to judge the nations that invaded Judah and sold people into captivity. That includes Babylon, of course, but also, as I just suggested, Tyre, Sidon, Philistia, and even Greece. Greece is named here. But there is great irony in this, isn't there? Didn't Joel tell us in chapter 2, remember, that the invaders, the Babylonians and all these other people that helped them, didn't Joel tell us that the invaders were God's army? Hope you remember that. They were God's army. That Yahweh himself had led them down from the north against Judah. So why does God judge them? Right? This text tells us God is going to judge the Babylonians and their allies for what they did to Judah, even though back in chapter 2, God's the one who brought them down here. Doesn't that strike you as being a little bit strange? So why does he judge them? It's important to remember that God often, this is not the first time we see this, God often uses the evil acts committed by others for his own good purposes. Think about the Old Testament story of Joseph. It's my favorite and best example of this, right? Joseph sold into slavery by his brothers. Was that an evil thing, Sandra? What they did to him? Absolutely, right? That was evil. It was wrong. But at the end of the story, remember what Joseph told his brothers when they finally found out he was Pharaoh's right-hand man, and they're shaking in their boots, thinking that he's going to kill them for what they did to him? Joseph says, don't be afraid. What you meant for evil, what? God meant for good. You see. God planned for his brothers to do that evil deed and allowed them to do it because he planned to bring good out of it. Think about, even better example though, the crucifixion of Jesus. Has there ever been a more evil deed done by human beings than the murder of the Son of God? That's been the greatest crime humanity's ever committed. But think about this. Out of that evil crime has come the greatest good that's ever happened to the human race. Am I right? We all know that. The Babylonians and these others invaded Judah for their own evil reasons. They didn't come down there to invade Judah because God said, hey, come judge my people for their sins. Is that why they came? No. Why did the Babylonians come down there? Zach, you got any guesses on that? Conquer more land and take their stuff, right? It mentions in our text that they took away the gold and the silver, right?
Wasn't this around the time where, I forgot what the king's name was, but he showed the Babylonian king his possession?
Not long after, yeah, that was Hezekiah. And it wasn't very long after that. You're exactly right. So yeah. The Babylonians and their allies invaded Judah for their own evil purposes, for plunder and murder, to enslave people and sell them on the slave market and all that, right? So they came down for their own evil reasons to capture the wealth of Judah and use their people as slaves. But God brought them down there for his reasons. God allowed them to do this as a means of chastising his rebellious people, Judah, right? Which is what we talked about before. So even though Babylon and the others were God's army in one sense, what they did was nevertheless a wicked deed deserving of God's punishment. Look at verse 4. Moreover, what are you to me, O Tyre, Sidon, and all the regions of Philistia? Are you rendering me a recompense? But if you do recompense me, swiftly and speedily I will return your recompense on your head. The question that God asked him reveals the fact that these people's actions against God and his people were unjustified. The Babylonians and the people of Tyre and Sidon were not morally justified in coming down there and doing what they did to Judah. And God promises to turn the tables on them by bringing on them the same curses that he brought on Judah. Look at verses 7 and 8. Behold, I'm going to arouse them from the place where you have sold them, talking about Judah, and return your recompense on your head. Also, I will sell your sons. See, they sold Judah's sons, right? I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the sons of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabeans, to a distant nation, for the Lord has spoken. In verses 9 through 16, we hear God challenging all the nations, all the surrounding nations, to prepare for war. He tells the Babylonians and the people of Tyre and Sidon, Philistia, he tells them, get ready for battle. Draw your swords, prepare yourselves, right? And it's clear from the context that this is not just any battle, but it refers to a great, perhaps final battle to be waged between God and all those who rebel against him. I think this is hinted at, even though there might be a more closer hand fulfillment of this, right? But nevertheless, here God is promising Judah that someday God will enter into a confrontation with their enemies and his. Look how universal in scope this is. This is why this may be referring to some final battle, at least it could imply that. He says, let all the fighting men, in verse 9, draw near me. In verse 10, he says, beat your plowshares into swords. That is, he's telling the nations, bring every weapon you can bring. Take even your farm implements, your plowshares, your pruning hooks, your whatever you use to farm with, right? Take them down to the ironsmith and have them beat those instruments into weapons. Bring every weapon you can, right? By the way, this is kind of a side note. There are several places in the Old Testament where we have this phrase about beating plowshares. I'm sorry. There's several places where it says beat your swords into plowshares. But here it's the opposite, right? Some people take that other phrase, beat your swords into plowshares. Well, that's all talking about peace, right? Stop war, have peace. In every place where that happens, though, where it talks about beating swords into plowshares and getting rid of your weapons and turning them into farm implements, it's not a commandment. It's a prediction about what may happen or will happen later, right? God never commands, and I'm bringing this up because I've had people talk to me about this and try to defend pacifism by using those texts about beating swords into plowshares, right? But those texts don't support pacifism for two reasons. One, because those texts are not commandments. They're predictions about what God's going to do later, right? God's going to get rid of war, right? But the only place where there's a commandment that talks about swords and plowshares is right here, where it says, take your plowshares and beat them into swords. No, there's no pacifism in the Bible. Sorry. That was a side note. That was a freebie, right? But then it goes on to say, same verse, verse 10, even let the weaklings, bring every weapon you can, and even let the weaklings become warriors, right? Everyone is to come out and fight. They are all to assemble, notice, in the valley of Jehoshaphat. Literally, that translates to the valley of judgment. The valley of judgment. In this expression, we see God's true intent for this battle. This battle he's inviting these nations to is not a real contest. Why is it not a real contest, Jordan?
It's one-sided.
It's one-sided, right? Exactly, right? And that's a no-brainer, right? It's not a real contest. It's called the Valley of Judgment because it's a time for judgment. God's going to win the battle and he's going to judge these nations. This is brought out in verse 14. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. I have heard this text quoted and used for evangelistic purposes. Maybe you have too. Some people think this verse is about evangelism. Preachers have used this as proof text to tell people that they need Christ. Now, people do need Christ, right? But this verse isn't talking about that. This is not the kind of decision that Joel's talking about. The valley of decision is not called the valley of decision because people are invited to come there and make a decision. The only one making a decision here is God, right? The word decision is actually a courtroom term in the Hebrew. It's a courtroom term. That's why some translations don't use the word decision. It uses a different word. It uses a courtroom word. When a jury gives their decision, what do they call that? Verdict, right? So really, this is the valley of the verdict, right? Which is about judgment, you see. It's all about judgment. The one making the decision, the verdict, is none other than God himself. And it's a decision that will determine people's eternal destiny. There's great irony here as well in this summons to battle. Since the fall of mankind, I want you to think about this. Since the fall of mankind, humans have been in constant warfare with God, seeking to usurp his authority. Started in the Garden of Eden, right, Nicholas? All the way back there. Joel tells us that the day of the Lord is coming in which God will summon all the rebels to a final showdown. And he's going to say, okay, let's have it out once and for all. Right? The irony lies in who it is, as I've already hinted, right? Who it is that the rebels fight against, right? They're fighting against the creator of the universe. They're fighting against the creator of the universe. It's a fight we cannot win. No human being can win, right? Psalm 2, I love this. This cannot help but remind me of Psalm 2, where we're told that God laughs. You ever read Psalm 2? God laughs at the feeble efforts of men to rebel against him. Right? Think about it. Why shouldn't he laugh? Because it's no contest, right? He laughs at the feeble efforts of men to rebel against him. God does not cower in fear because he knows the final outcome, and so do we. Right? So do we. This is Joel's message to Christian people today. The nations may rage, but God will judge them and defeat them once and for all. Every soul that calls God enemy will be destroyed. And that's supposed to be and is an encouraging word to God's people in bleak times, such as perhaps times that we may live in now. Okay? The Apostle John, seeking to encourage Christians in a time of persecution, borrowed a lot of language from Joel and other Old Testament prophets as well to describe a big showdown between God and his enemies. Look at Revelation chapter 14. Revelation 14, verses 17 through 20. Listen to this. And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Then another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, "Put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the cluster from the vines of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. Some of that language, where does some of the language from that text comes from? It's a dumb question because we're talking about Joel, right? It's coming from Joel, chapter 3. He's quoting, at least some of that language is coming straight out of Joel chapter 3. Now, I believe, and you don't have to agree with me, this is absolutely controversial, as some of you probably know. But it's my conviction that what John is describing here in Revelation 14, as he is in most of Revelation, is not the end of the world. He is describing the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans in AD 70, right? And so what does that tell us? That means John is taking this language from Joel and applying it to AD 70. Which means that may imply, can't be utterly dogmatic here, that's what Joel always meant. That's the fulfillment of his prophecy, is what happened in AD 70. And it's hard to be dogmatic on that. There are plenty of people who would disagree with that, but I think that's probably right, for what that's worth. But in any case, even if that is right, and he's talking here in chapter 14 and applying Joel's prophecy to what happened in AD 70, I do believe that this is typical. You know, you've heard of something called typology in the Bible, right? I believe this is typical of that final showdown between God and his enemies that John describes later in Revelation in chapter 20. Look with me there, Revelation 20, verses 7 through 10. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So my question for you is, where will you be on that day? Assuming we live to see it, right? Only God knows, right? But if we do, where will you be in that day? Will you be standing with the nations who receive the guilty verdict and perish? Or will you be standing under the blood of Christ where there is now no condemnation. Right? Back to Joel chapter 3. We're almost done. Joel chapter 3. Oh, sorry, that's not Joel. Verses 16 through 21, picking up where I left off, express the great blessing given to those who know Christ on the day of judgment. Verse 16, notice, the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth tremble. But the Lord is a refuge for his people, and a stronghold to the sons of Israel. This assures us that God will protect his people from judgment. Whether we're talking about the judgment that fell on the Babylonians not long after Joel, or the judgment that fell on the unbelieving Jews in AD 70, or the judgment that's going to fall on the entire world one day, right? God will protect his people from judgment, not because we're innocent, right, Zach? Not because we're innocent, but because Christ has paid for our sins already. In verse 21, God promises to pardon all who know Christ. Also in verse 21, it kind of sums up the whole chapter. The Lord dwells in Zion. That's the best news of all. The Lord dwells in Zion. That is, God is with his people. Right? And this tells us several things. This tells us that one line, the Lord dwells in Zion, tells us at least these three things. Number one, we have the guarantee that the enemies of God and the enemies of his people will be punished. Every wrong will be righted. Secondly, it tells us that we have the guarantee that God's people are special to him. Isn't that right? God's people are special to him. And despite our current trials and tribulations, we will enjoy a day free from sorrow and pain one of these days. And third, we have the guarantee of eternal, intimate fellowship with our God. John saw those truths too, right? John talks about God dwelling in Zion. Look at the end of the book of Revelation, all the way in chapter 21. Revelation 21, notice verse 34. Well, that can't be right. There is no 34. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a dash between 3 and 4 in my notes, but it's tiny. Verses 3 to 4. All right? 21, verse 3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people. And God himself will be among them, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there will be no longer any death. There will be no longer any mourning or crying or pain, for the first things have passed away." And it's no accident that right after this, he describes the descent of the new Jerusalem down from heaven, right? That's Zion, right? Which is symbolic of the church, which is Zion. The church is Zion today. Did you know that? The church is the Israel of God. All right. Y'all got any questions or thoughts before I draw this to a close? Yeah.
I think it's really clear that chapter 3 is about 80-70 because with the end of chapter 2 being about 80-70, chapter 3 starts, "For behold, in those days and at that time."
Sure, yeah.
So,
I'm fine with that. And in fact, that's why I tied Revelation 14 back into Joel chapter 3 for that
also
very
Revelation
reason.
19,
Yeah.
It talks about striking down the nation.
I believe that, but I'm not convinced that that's what he's talking about in Revelation 20. And that was my point. Revelation 20, I believe, is about the future, our future. But that's something we could take up again on another occasion. But yeah, I'm in agreement with that. That chapter 3 is talking at least. Well, I think it's also talking about the more immediate destruction of Babylon and Tyre and Sidon, which is coming very soon. But certainly John picks up and applies it to 87. No doubt about that. Yeah, good point.